Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video. Although I suppose this week's mystery could also come under my history series also. You all know that I love a bit of a historical story, so today I've got one for you that I've had on my list for quite a while. This is a 120-year-old mystery that happened on the island of Eilean, one of the Flannan Isles in the Outer Hebrides just off the west coast of mainland Scotland. Every single documentary, podcast, video that I've listened to on this topic seems to pronounce Eilean in a different way. Eilean. I really do not know what the correct pronunciation is. Eilean seems to be the most common one, so I'm going to go with that. But if there's any Scots out there and I'm pronouncing this wrong, then I'm so sorry. 3 men just vanished, never to be seen again. And this was a really interesting one to research. It seems like there is so much misinformation around this case. I mean, almost 120 years of speculation will tend to do that to any story. This is a story that's often spoke about as being a complete mystery. A lone island in the middle of the ocean, dark, stormy weather, 3 men and no one else around for miles. And then they just go missing. It has the basis for a very creepy horror story, which is what I think really tends to capture people's imaginations when it comes to this case. Certainly going into it, I was convinced that this was going to be one of those cases that sadly we'll never really know what happened with. But 120 years of speculation and storytelling isn't always the best for keeping the facts straight. And honestly, I'm not convinced that this is much of a mystery at all. But before we get into this video, I would like to thank Magellan TV for once again sponsoring this channel. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming site with hundreds of documentaries about a huge range of different topics. For someone who watches as many documentaries as I do, it's amazing to have a whole streaming service dedicated to just documentaries. I cannot recommend Magellan TV enough. They have everything from true crime to science, history, nature and everything in between, with new programmes added weekly that can be watched anywhere on your TV, laptop and mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and loads of the programmes are available in 4K as well. As always, I'm going to give you a couple of documentary recommendations that I hope you will enjoy as much as I did, and this week's choices are Total Recall, How to Remember Everything, in which a group of Brits embark on a challenge to compete at the World Memory Championships in China. I didn't even know that was a thing. Apparently it is a thing. I thought it was a really interesting documentary. I love documentaries that like you wouldn't even think about in a million years. Like, would I ever be interested in like making my memory amazing? Probably not, but the documentary was awesome. And the second one is Calamity Jane, Legend of the West. I didn't know anything about Calamity Jane, even though it was a name that I've heard many times before, and now I know all about her. But let's go back to the video. So it was really hard to keep all the facts straight in this case, and I very nearly gave up researching until I found a book called The Lighthouse, The Mystery of the Eilean Lighthouse Keepers by Keith McClusky, which just did a really good job of sticking to the facts and keeping everything straight whilst dismissing a lot of the rumours and speculation that float around this case. I would highly recommend you read that if you want an even deeper look into this story. And as always, all my sources will be linked down below in the description box if you want to go and learn more. At the risk of sounding patronising, I'm going to give you a bit of context surrounding lighthouses in general and lighthouses around the 1900s. The particular lighthouse I'm going to focus on in this story had officially become operational on the 7th of December 1899, just a year before our story takes place, and it had been built on Eilean, which was the largest of the Flannan Isles, a collection of 7 islands just off of the coast of Scotland. In perfect conditions, this light had a range of about 24 miles. That's a very big light. In a time when most trade was done via ships and the sea, lighthouses were a vital system to mark dangerous coastlines and rocks. They were also used as a navigational system for both ships and planes, although that second use did become more common slightly later. Nowadays, of course, with modern technology, lighthouses have become less vital in aiding ships around coastlines, although many are still active as backup just in case technology fails, which it does sometimes. 120 years ago, they would have been manned and worked by actual humans, something which is almost obsolete now. They're mostly controlled remotely, computerised. Humans are no longer required in lighthouses. The last manned lighthouse in the UK closed in 1998, and if I'm correct, there are also no officially manned lighthouses left in the USA either. Although weirdly, there seems to be lots of manned lighthouses left in Canada, which is strange. In 1900, lighthouse keepers would have been required on Eilean Moor and anywhere there was a lighthouse to trim the wick, replenish fuel, wind clocks, and just perform general maintenance tasks to keep everything running smoothly, and of course make sure that the light actually works. For a lighthouse keeper, their job was their life. This wasn't a 9-to-5 profession. As long as you were on the island, you were working. It was a 24-hour job. Flannan Isles was a double-manned lighthouse, which essentially meant that there were 6 keepers in total, 2 complete teams of 3 keepers, 1 principal lighthouse keeper and 2 assistant lighthouse keepers staying in the lighthouse at all times. They would work in 28-day shifts, 28 days on the island and 28 days off, where they could return back to the mainland to be with their families and just live their normal life. And the 2 sets of crews would just constantly switch every 28 days. Imagine 28-day shifts. On the island, their job was fairly simple: keep the light running. The keepers ran on a system where each of them would rotate 4 hours on and 4 hours off throughout the night. The light was always lit at dusk and extinguished at dawn. I could go into more detail about how the mechanics of a lighthouse and its light worked, exactly what a keeper would do to keep the light lit, flashing and strong, but I'm not really sure that's all necessary. It was basically a pulley system that had to be rewound every half an hour to 45 minutes to keep the light flashing. So whoever was on duty had to remain alert. And the keepers would generally be on a rota of 6 PM till 10 PM, then they would switch keeper who would keep watch from 10 PM to 2 AM, and then the third keeper would do 2 AM to 6 AM, and obviously the timings would change depending on the sunset and sunrise times daily. Each morning, the principal lighthouse keeper and 1 assistant would gather in the kitchen of the lighthouse to get on with tasks of the day, because they didn't just work in the lighthouse, they also lived in the lighthouse. There was kitchen and bedrooms and all that. As well as keeping the light going, they also had to keep up with the general maintenance of the lighthouse, whether this be cooking, cleaning, painting, repair work, and there was also paperwork to keep track of the activities the night before as well. This ran as a well-oiled machine. Everything worked as it should do. And this is where our mystery begins. In December 1900, there were 3 keepers on the Rock, as there always were. These were James Ducat, who was the principal, Thomas Marshall, who was the assistant, and Donald MacArthur, who was actually an occasional lighthouse keeper. Donald MacArthur wasn't supposed to be on the island at this particular time, but the usual assistant lighthouse keeper, William Ross, had been taken ill and needed to be replaced. Donald was what was known as an OLK, an occasional lighthouse keeper. He was a local resident trained in lighthouse duties should there be an emergency, such as one of the keepers falling ill. And that's what happened, so Donald MacArthur is shipped off to the lighthouse. On Friday the 14th of December 1900 at 10 PM, the watches changed. Donald took over from James as the one to man the light for the next 4 hours. At 2 AM, Donald roused Thomas from his sleep for his turn, and then Thomas passed over to James for the last watch of the night at 6 AM. Donald was the cook on duty for the week, so just after 7 AM on the 15th, he begins to prepare breakfast for the team, and they all eat together. At dawn, the light is extinguished for the day and the paraffin fuel is refilled. It seems that everything happened as normal on Flannan Isles that morning, and the team had lunch around 1 PM. After that, they all vanished, never to be seen again. But it took days for anyone to notice. Of course, they were alone on this rock. This island was literally just a 43-acre piece of land in the middle of the ocean, 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis. There was no one else around. There was a ruined chapel on the island dedicated to St. Flannan, but that was about it. There was no one else there to notice that these 3 men disappeared, and it actually took a number of days before any alarm was raised. The Northern Lighthouse Board, known as the NLB, paid a gamekeeper called Roderick McKenzie on the Isle of Lewis, which is the largest island in the Outer Hebrides, to basically just keep an eye on this light from the lighthouse. As the lighthouse had no telegram system, they had no way of immediately letting anyone know if something went wrong on the rock. The light acting strangely or not being on at all would be the only way that somebody not on the island would have a clue that something was wrong. This gamekeeper's job was basically just to make sure that there were no unusual signals coming from the lighthouse on Eilean Moor. And this is important to bear in mind. His job was specifically to watch for any signals from the lighthouse, rather than the light just not being on. If he was to ever note any signal that indicated a problem on the island, he was to send a telegram immediately to the head office of the NLB and inform them of what was happening. The NLB could then organise for a repair team to be sent out to Eilean Moor as soon as possible. He wasn't ever told to do this if the light just didn't come on. The last time that Roderick saw this light fully functioning was on the 7th of December 1900, but then the weather got bad. The weather at this time was particularly horrific. There were rain, storms, and actually weather of this magnitude hasn't been recorded again since, so this was a particularly bad year. Roderick said that sometimes in bad weather he wouldn't see the light for many days due to the fog. This light was designed to reach a 24-mile radius in perfect weather conditions. In bad conditions, it was nowhere near this. Plus, Roderick was supposed to be looking for signals, nothing else. He later reported that he did see the light briefly on the 12th, but then he doesn't see it again until the 29th, when new men were left on the island to get the light up and running again. In the many days following the 12th, he begins to get concerned, and he asks his sons to help him keep an eye out for this light because he hasn't seen it properly in so long. But Roderick wasn't the only one who had noticed that something was up with the light. At almost midnight on the 15th of December, a cargo vessel named the SS Arctor was making a journey from Philadelphia, USA to Leith in Scotland. As it approached the Flannan Isles, the captain sensed that something wasn't quite right. Despite it being a relatively clear night compared to the storms they dealt with for most of their journey, all they could see on the horizon was darkness. The captain knew that there should be a light from the new Eilean Moor lighthouse shining somewhere near. They were within about 5 or 6 miles of it, but he could see nothing. The ship eventually docks in Leith on the 17th of December, with the captain making his concerns about the Flannan Islands known the next morning on the 18th of December. This statement of concern from this captain wouldn't actually reach the NLB for another 10 days, at which point it seems that people were already aware that something strange had happened on the rock. Of course, with Lighthouse Keepers staying on this remote island in the middle of nowhere for 28 days at a time, they would need occasional replenishments of food and supplies, something that was supplied to them by a relief vessel called the Hesperus. So on Christmas Eve, the Hesperus leaves its base to do its rounds. It heads to Lewis to collect the supplies and the relief lightkeeper, a man called Joseph Moore, but the weather was really bad, and this delayed their departure until Boxing Day, the 26th of December. So the Hesperus arrives at Eilean Moor a couple of days later than it should have been, but they notice that something's wrong before they even docked at Eilean Moor, as the lighthouse flag hadn't been raised. Usually the keepers would raise this flag to show that they'd seen the relief vessel on its way and that they were expecting them on the island. So the ship notices this flag isn't up, so it sounds its horn, to no response. A signal rocket's fired, no response. And no provision box had been left out, as was usually customary. So the captain of the Hesperus decides to send out Joseph Moore. They back the ship up onto the rocks and Joseph clambers up onto the land. Joseph makes his way to the top of the cliff, finding the lighthouse doors closed, but not locked. He walks inside the kitchen and notes that the fire hadn't been lit in several days, and no beds had been made. The entire place was deserted, and he runs back out to tell the others aboard the ship what he discovered, that there was no one there. Now, there are many reports that suggest that food was cold on the table and a chair was knocked over, as if there'd been some kind of rush to get out the lighthouse, something you'll see over and over and over again in retellings of this story. But as far as I can find, Joseph Moore never reported any of that. He did report, however, that the clocks had stopped. At this time, clocks would need to be wound up every so often to continue working, and this clock in the kitchen clearly hadn't been wound in a while. The pots and pans had been cleaned up after lunch, and all of the jobs that were to be done before noon had been completed, showing that whatever had happened had most likely happened in the mid to late afternoon on the 15th. The last completed written entries in the lighthouse log were for the 13th of December, but there were also notes made on the 14th, and it was noted what time the light was extinguished on the morning of the 15th. So it's clear that this was most likely the date that something had happened and the crew had vanished. The captain of the Hesperus decides to keep Joseph Moore on the island to continue the running of the lighthouse. And as this new keeper tries to get to grip with this lighthouse, officials start to search for answers as to what happened. It's realised that there was one set of oilskins left behind, which is basically this strong waterproof garment that keepers would have had to have worn outside in stormy weather. 2 sets of the oilskins were gone, but 1 set was still left in the lighthouse. But it was noted that it was not permitted at any time for all 3 keepers to abandon the lighthouse. At least 1 person had to remain inside and man the light at all times. It was one of the most important rules of the job. The fact that all 3 men had gone and 1 set of oilskins was left made it look as if whoever had left the lighthouse last had most likely done so in a rush, and probably for a good reason. The same day they've discovered all this, Boxing Day, the first telegram is sent to the NLB from the captain of the Hesperus, notifying them that something had happened. Verbatim, the telegram read, quote, "A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannan. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. On our arrival there this afternoon, no signs of life were to be seen on the island. Fired a rocket, but as no response was made, managed to land Moore, who went up to the station and found no keepers there. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane or something like that. Night coming on, we could not wait to make further investigation, but we'll go off again tomorrow morning to try and learn something as to their fate. I have left Moore, MacDonald, the boymaster and 2 seamen on the island to keep the light burning until you make other arrangements. Will not return to Oban until I hear from you. I have repeated this wire to Muirhead. In case you are not at home, I will remain at the telegraph office tonight until it closes if you wish to wire me. Master Hesperus." Unquote. This is dated the 26th of December 1900. It is ordered officially for the lighthouse to continue running as smoothly as possible, and a keeper from another nearby lighthouse is ordered to drive to the Hesperus and board for the journey across. Even though that it was clear that a tragedy had taken place here, it was still everyone's #1 priority to actually keep the light running. They needed to keep ships and their crews safe. They needed to prevent any further tragedy happening. Superintendent Robert Muirhead arrives on Eilean Moor on the 29th of December, along with the replacement lightkeeper. His report is dated for 10 days later on the 8th of January, so he clearly thought very carefully about what his report was going to say, in which he does come to a conclusion about what he thought had happened. I was going to read you the entire report by Muirhead, but it's actually very, very long, so instead I'm just going to leave it down below in the description box and summarise the main points. Basically, he interviewed everyone involved in the discovery of the mystery and investigated all aspects of the island that he could. His report begins by talking about the actions of Boxing Day, how Joseph Moore went onto the rock, found that all 3 men had disappeared. It talks about how it was discovered that they were still active on the morning of the 15th of December. All morning chores had been done and lunch had been eaten and cleaned up. No mention of the cold food being left out on the table, as many reports love to sensationalise. Then it details the more thorough search of the island, which I haven't already gone over in this video. So, they found everything at the east landing place in order, that all the ropes kept there were coiled and where they should be, as they were the last time the superintendent had come to check the lighthouse to an inspection on the 7th of December. He was the last person to see them alive. And everything at the east landing was exactly as it was on the 7th. Everything at the lighthouse also stood as it should do. However, there were signs of the severity of the weather at the west landing place. The sea was still high even now, so long after the disappearance, so Muirhead couldn't even get close enough to investigate fully. He noted that the crane that had been erected there at the west landing that summer was completely unharmed. I tried to find a full explanation as to what this crane was for, to no avail, but I'm going to guess that it's what the keepers used to get their provisions from the Hesperus when it came to replenish them, probably. Anyway, they'd had one crane that had been destroyed by the weather the winter before, so in the summer it was replaced and everything was still good with that. There was no evidence that anyone had been messing with the crane anytime recently. Everything with the crane was just as it was on the 7th when the superintendent last visited. But the mooring ropes, landing ropes, derrick landing ropes and crane handles, which were all kept in a wooden box about 110 foot above sea level, had been washed away, and the ropes were all strewn in the crevice of the rock near the crane platform and entangled amongst the crane legs. But they were all coiled up. No single coil was found unfastened. They were just coiled up at the bottom of this crevice. The iron railings around the crane platform and the concrete stairs leading up from the west landing were displaced and twisted. Iron, all twisted up. A lifebuoy fastened to the railings that was to only be used in case of emergency had disappeared, but likely due to the waves that caused the rest of the damage and not anyone interfering with it. This next part is taken directly from Muirhead's reports. Quote, "When the accident occurred, Ducat was wearing sea boots and a waterproof, and Marshall sea boots and oilskins. And as Moore assures me that the men only wore those articles when going down to the landings, they must have intended, when they left the station, either to go down to the landing or the proximity." Muirhead concluded, after careful examination, that the most likely explanation of the disappearance was that they'd all gone down on the afternoon of Saturday the 15th of December to the west landing to secure the box with all the ropes in. But whilst they were doing so, a large wave came up onto the rock and swept them away with it. It seems likely that James Ducat and Thomas Marshall had maybe gone out there first, leaving Donald MacArthur behind at the lighthouse. But maybe Donald kept watch and saw something happen or heard the men call out for help, so he rushes out of the lighthouse against all standard procedure. The emergency was too urgent to take the time to put on his oilskin. Muirhead says that he's confident that they were swept away by a large wave rather than due to a strong gust of wind, due to weather reports at the time. He signs off the report expressing regret at what had taken place, but says that there was little anyone on land could have done to prevent this from happening or to save the men. But the question remains, why, in these horribly stormy conditions, would they make the decision to go out of the lighthouse just to secure a box of ropes? It seems that their priority should have been keeping themselves safe, and they'd already seen the year before that the weather was strong enough to bring down an entire crane, so why would they go out there? Well, it was found that Thomas Marshall had previously been branded negligent and was fined 5 shillings after some equipment was washed away during a storm. 5 shillings was a pretty heavy fine at the time, and I'm sure this would have been at the forefront of their minds whilst this storm was raging. Marshall and Ducat may have ventured out just to make sure that everything was secure, which ironically it seems like it was not, as the ropes were found scattered around the bottom of the rocks. Of course, this is just a theory. Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, is usually the correct one. No one really knows what happened on the rock that afternoon, but it just makes sense that it was probably a big storm and they were washed away. But their bodies never washed up anywhere, none of them were ever found. So of course that kind of leaves an open-ended case here and much room for speculation, even though 120 years later they would definitely be dead by now. Newspapers at the time ran with the story, but it doesn't seem like it actually became the mystery it's known as today until the poem Flannan Isle by Wilfred Wilson Gibson was published in 1912, which painted an eerie picture of the day the men disappeared. Again, I'll link the poem down below as it is quite long, but this poem is actually likely the origin of a lot of the misinformation around this case. The reports of a chair being knocked over and cold food on the table. Wilfred took a little bit of artistic license with the story, and apparently this was just taken as fact by many. But let's ponder some of these other theories. There's the outright implausible stories of a giant sea serpent or a giant seabird grabbing and carrying the men away. Or that it was the supernatural, the lighthouse was haunted, or a boat filled with ghosts docked on the island and took the men away. It's probably logical to say that these theories are quite unlikely, although I'm sure there are conspiracy people out there who fully believe they were abducted by a giant seabird, which would make for an interesting story. Other theories are that they were abducted by aliens. For some reason I feel like that's more plausible than the giant seabird story, and I'm just going with it. Aliens, why not? Maybe the UFO just happened to land on the iron railings and damage it. Maybe. And then there's a theory that they were abducted by foreign spies. Couldn't find any clarification as to what nationality these foreign spies apparently were, but it was a big rumour at the time. Again, this theory is not impossible, but it's just more unlikely than them just being washed away by a big wave. The only other theory which I would consider to be viable is one of a fight between the 3 keepers. It's alleged that Donald, the occasional keeper, was actually a very volatile character and easily angered, which probably aren't the best personality traits to have when your job involves being stuck in a lighthouse on a rock with 2 other men for 28 days at a time. But then again, Donald was only an occasional keeper, a member of the public trained in lighthouse duties to take over when an assistant keeper was sick or indisposed. So he wouldn't have been as used to the conditions as others may have been. This is a very, very isolated and lonely job. It's very, very difficult. Is it possible that the 3 men got into an argument that afternoon? As it's thought that Donald was actually only in short sleeves at the time he disappeared, his oilskins and coat still inside, could he have stormed out in a rage and the other 2 followed him to calm him or get him back inside? Did they get into an altercation on the cliff and maybe somebody was pushed into the water, or they fell, or the wave did come up but it's just a different reason for leaving the lighthouse? Or maybe it was just a stroke of madness that caused them all to end up leaving the lighthouse. Psychological issues in lighthouse workers are really quite common, although they weren't very well understood at the time. Either way, it still ends up with the men falling victim to the sea over anything else. It's more of a question of why did they leave the lighthouse rather than what really happened to them, because I think we can probably all agree that the sea did get them. And that's the story of the mystery of the Flannan Isles, which we can all probably agree at this point isn't too much of a mystery at all. There are definitely still questions surrounding the disappearance and what exactly led them to leave the lighthouse that day, but it's not as much of a mystery as legend would have you believe. I did debate not covering this case when I first realised that it's not really a mystery at all, but then I thought that it's probably important that the true story is put out there. So if you've ever heard of the Flannan Isles before, hopefully I've dispelled some of the rumours. There's so much misinformation out there that sometimes it's just important to dispel some of that. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, then please make sure you subscribe to my channel and check out a few other videos I've done. Everything is listed in playlists on my channel to make it easier for you to find what you want to watch. I'm trying to reach 150,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so if you want to share my channel with mystery-loving friends or family, then that would really be amazing. And make sure you check out Magellan TV, linked in the top line of the description down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.